I'm a quantitative sociologist, and so everything I do is data driven, and I spend a lot of time in front of a screen looking at numbers. And then I met, and most of the work that I do is on incarceration, recidivism, sentencing patterns, and I started focusing in on extreme sentences in Louisiana to try to understand why it is that we are leading the nation. And really it comes down to excessive sentences. It's not, when you start taking all these other pieces away of the puzzle, we have a fifth of all folks who are incarcerated in Louisiana serving 20 years or more. That's higher than any other place, certainly in the South. I always use the South as comparison states because certainly with respect to advocacy, nobody really in Louisiana is moved by what's happening in California. So we try to keep it here. But then, so I had all this amazing data on incredibly low recidivism rates for folks who have served, a couple to 3 decades in prison when they come home. And I couldn't understand why people weren't more moved by the data. And then I met this man who some of you may have come across, named Calvin Duncan, who was released from prison after serving 28 and a half years with the help from the Innocence Project. And while he was at Angola, he served as inmate counsel. And in that capacity, really got to know some of these men a little bit better than if they're just in the dorm together. And I was showing him all this data, and he was not surprised at all, because he had grown up with most of these folks. He knew the people behind these numbers, and had watched them go through these significant changes as we age. Age is the most powerful predictor of reoffending. And so he wasn't surprised by all of that. And so we were trying to figure out, well, how do we get this out? Because nobody's really responding to the data. And then I realized that, people don't make empathetic connections to data points. They make empathetic connections to people and their stories. And so Calvin and I decided we needed to find a way to get these stories out. And so I abandoned my quantitative hat and put on an ethnography hat. We got permission to go into Angola. I ended up filming 150 filmed oral history interviews. Once I got the access, I was only going to go in there with a field recorder, and once I got in, I realized this is an amazing opportunity. We need to get these stories out. And the result was this project called the Visiting Room Project. I also went into the women's prison because they're always ignored, and I interviewed about 50 women there serving life sentences. And so that's the project that we're working on right now with the editing. So I'm going to try to go through this, and I can also refer you to this. There's it's up here. I can actually send you a copy of this or send it to Professor Lewis. We can figure something out. But Professor Armstrong at Loyola Law School and I worked on a massive data landscape project looking at everything from pretrial incarceration data, reentry data, and it's a publication from the Public Welfare Foundation that has much more data than anybody could go through in one day. But it's a fairly good resource for every aspect of the criminal legal system in Louisiana, including juvenile justice as well. So a lot of the numbers that I'm going to go through with you today come from that original project. I just sort of reworked them here. So Louisiana and southern states. So I've got Louisiana, Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, and Oklahoma. Okay, so one of the things that I've stopped doing is when we look at race in the criminal legal system in Louisiana, the first time I started looking at these things about 20 years ago, I was just shocked. And over time, I'm trying not to go down that slippery slope of, well, what do you expect? It's Louisiana. I think that outrage is important. And I go over these things, and I think people have very little idea just how alarming the disparities are. Yes, we understand there's a little, but when you actually look at the numbers and the ratios, so what I've done for all of the data So when they calculate incarceration rates for black folks and white folks, they use the general population. They look at the incarceration rate, they divide it by the population, they multiply by 100,000 to get a factor. You get really misleading information that way. I have calculated all of my data by looking at not only states but then individual parish level data for all 64 parishes that looks at the incarceration rate, the black incarceration rate per 100,000 black residents. That's the way we ought to be looking at it. Similarly, for New Orleans, it could skew the other way if you have a majority minority city or parish. So anyway, if we look at this data, what you see is that Louisiana is the leader in overall incarceration rates. It is the leader, not quite the leader for white incarceration rates. That goes to Oklahoma. For the black incarceration rate, we're right up there. The overall incarceration rate is high, and the racial disparities are 4 to 1. So 4 black folks are incarcerated for every one white person in this state. That's actually fairly common in the South, so we're not an outlier in that way. But we are now leading the nation in incarceration. So what's driving this? This is the thing that requires a lot of work to sort of figure out what's causing it, right? Because we have so many things going on at once, we're unable to control in an experimental fashion for what's driving our issues here. So you really have to actually go outside of Louisiana and look and see what's happening in other places. So where you have other states with really high incarceration, what are the driving factors there? You've got to look at all of the research that we can put together on this. In my view, I've concluded that there are 3 things that we have that are really driving this issue. And unfortunately, when I realized that I had an invitation to speak to judges across Louisiana, one of the things that I realized when I was putting this together is that judges have very little discretion to do anything about these things, these major driving factors. There are some, my understanding is there are some situations where judges can refuse, for example, a habitual offender enhancement penalty, or in fact, if they believe that it's an unconstitutional sentence. But that's very, very rare. And so essentially, these things are being driven by prosecutors. And judges very rarely, you see, impose some kind of downward departure for whatever a prosecutor is bringing to them. And so where it goes there is like the legislature, but the legislature is informed by judges. So these conversations, there's still a massive role for judges to play in this. Mandatory sentencing schemes is a major, major driver behind our problem. Mandatory life without parole for all kinds of offenses is another driver. We have, and I'll show you this, we'll get to life without parole a little bit later, but we lead the nation by far in terms of the percentage of people who are incarcerated in our prisons who are serving a life without parole sentence. There's one other state that's close behind, so I'll show you this in a minute, but about 16 to 17% of all people who are incarcerated in Louisiana are serving a life without parole sentence. Now, if you're thinking about what's driving incarceration rate, well, then none of them are coming home. So that's that stable population that's as opposed to the turnstile. There's one other state that comes a little bit close. It's at 12%, and everybody else is way down 1%, 2%. And that other state is Pennsylvania. And we don't have very much in common with Pennsylvania, but we do have one thing in common. We both have mandatory life without parole for second-degree murder. Those mandatory sentencing schemes take discretion away from judges, away from juries, the folks that we elect and entrust, and who are acting in our name, in our collective name, and yet we have no way of changing this scheme. That's one of the drivers. Now, by the way, I should say up front, I'm a sociologist. I'm not a philosopher or an ethicist. Sociology and social science cannot address the morality of anything. I cannot here tell you empirically this is an excessive punishment. But I can say, well, look, let's compare it with what other folks are doing. I can show you all of the data on recidivism and public safety and costs and all of it, and then you decide the moral aspects of it, right? As we all do. Of course, I have this moral compass that I have my own reaction to, but it's not my view on that is not empirically or scientifically more valid than anybody else's. But I can at least point out what's going on, and then the rest of us can decide, do we want to keep doing this? Restrictions on good time for crimes of violence. I think you had a presentation by Secretary LeBlanc on the justice reinvestment efforts. All of those efforts excluded crimes of violence from sentencing reform. Prosecutorial decision to invoke habitual offender penalty enhancements. That's another major driver. There is also, it's not a major driver, but there is also, we have lots of folks, juveniles, who are charged and treated as adults, much more than our neighboring states. And we also, this is a difficult thing to get data on, but anecdotally we're seeing lots of cases that are being re-examined where they are clearly upcharging cases. So a manslaughter case upcharged a second-degree murder, and of course the difference then, the impact on incarceration is enormous because that's a mandatory life sentence. These are the three things that I see. So mandatory sentencing schemes, including life without parole, restrictions on good time for crimes of violence, and of course always excluding, taking them off the table during any kind of reform effort, and then prosecutorial decisions about habitual offenders. I don't want to suggest that juveniles tried as adults are driving this. It's not driving the numbers, but it is happening. And then when you start to bury down a little bit further, get away from the state comparisons and start looking at parishes, it's a few parishes that are driving all of this. And I'm not familiar with all of you and where you're practicing, but a third of the incarcerated population come from 3 parishes. And you probably could guess them, right? Even if you can't read this slide. Orleans, Jefferson, East Baton Rouge. Half of all prisoners serving life without parole were convicted in 4. The Trinity here, Orleans, Jefferson, and East Baton Rouge, and then also Caddo. These same 4 parishes account for half of all juvenile offenders who are tried as adults. That's a prosecutorial discretion issue. So the same 4. And then half of all prisoners charged with the habitual offender statute, 50%, come from 2 parishes, Orleans and Jefferson. Now we know what's happening in Orleans. It's actually a rather grand experiment that I'm tracking all of the data for. But if it comes down to it, if 2 prosecutors just change their practices, it would impact more than half of that population. Sometimes that's a source of hope for me because that's something that you can do, right? Now, I'm biased. I think that in most cases habitual offender statutes are excessive. But if we decide we do want a downward departure from the use of the habitual offender statutes, it really is 2 places, and one of them's already changed. So those are the driving parishes. Again, it's unfortunate. I spent a lot of time putting this together to show you, but these are the 10 most populous parishes in Louisiana. So it's East Baton Rouge, Jefferson, Orleans, St. Tammany, Lafayette, Caddo, Calcasieu, Ouachita, Livingston, and Tangipahoa. And what I've done here is I've just looked at the number of incarcerated people, the incarceration rate overall, and then the highlights. Orleans has the highest of all of those. That's 1,000 per 100,000 New Orleans residents are incarcerated. The percent of the population of the parish that is black, because again that's something that we want to factor into, because race, you cannot escape race with any of this. And then the white incarceration rate, the black incarceration rate, and then the ratio of black to white. The highest disparities are in Orleans. Almost 8 to 1. Now this is controlling for the population, so it's controlling for the fact that New Orleans has 60% of the population is black. That's outrageous. If it was cancer or some other thing, we would all be in an uproar. But there's times you say, oh yeah, well we're in Orleans, we're in the South, it's Louisiana. That's just not good enough. Yes.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt because this is fascinating, but I do have a question. How long is it going to take, because you said there's an experiment underway in one of these
Yeah.
parishes. How long will it take for the data to be collected to determine whether or not
I would like
experiment is
5 years.
5 years?
Yes, we're in year 2.
Okay.
It's already had an impact. And rather,
He's going into the third,
yeah, rather interestingly, I'll tell you what, the Justice Reinvestment changes actually increased the percentage of folks who are serving life without parole. When the Justice Reinvestment started, we were about 13%. We were still way leading the nation. But what happened is that once we started releasing some of the lower level offenders, the proportion of the longer folks, so it looks worse, but it's actually good, but it looks worse because of those changes. Because none of the reform efforts are tackling the really long-serving population. So, and then again, I think it's really important to have the data and look at that and then say, is this good? Are we good with this? Do we want to continue with this? But until we start looking at the data, we're kind of, I feel like we're in the dark. I can forward this to you, but those are the numbers. Multi-billing and race. This gets even more pronounced. And you probably have a sense of how bad this disparity actually is. So Lafayette, which actually invokes the habitual offender statutes very seldomly, they account for just 1.74% of all folks who are multi-billed in the state. But when they do, the racial disparity is almost 20 to 1. I'm not that worried about Lafayette because they're not really driving this. What I am worried about is Orleans, where we have 28% of all habitual offenders are coming out of Orleans Parish. And the racial disparities there are about 10 to 1. When you look at juveniles, I haven't got down to how to say it, juveniles tried as adults, what percentage would you estimate would be black boys across the state?
Juvenile across the state?
Yeah.
Over 50.
Yeah. Like 80 to
Over
90.
95.
I was going to say 95.
Between 95 and 96% of black boys. And again, who makes those decisions? And so, as a judge, are you permitted to say, no, I'm not gonna do this? This is something I was talking to an attorney yesterday to try to get some clarity about when that there's a constitutional justification for a downward departure. We're not going to try this kid as an adult. Is that something that's even part of the choices that you think of?
Well, for the
For juvenile court, I mean, yes, that's where the decision starts with juvenile court. But if they're 16 and older, that is up to the DA's office. The only time that we have the decision in trying them as adults is if they're under the age of 16, or if there is a continued custody hearing and probable cause hearing, rather, as we call it in the adult system. Probable cause is not established, then, the kids, their trials, everything happens still in juvenile court. They're not transferred to the adult system. The discretion is limited.
Yeah, the discretion is limited.
It really is. So, I mean, it just depends.
Right. Multi-bill, do you track how many Dorothy motions or how many hearings where attorneys are asking for downward departures?
No.
It feels like a normal thing in federal court, but I'm just curious about if there's any tracking of that.
That's the problem. So I had to testify in a case in Minden, Louisiana, where an attorney was trying to make the case that the racial bias is so enormous in that parish, in Webster Parish, I think it is, that it's unconstitutional. He actually prevailed in that situation. But and what I did is I just showed them the data, the racial disparities, but I don't have a way of looking at how many whites could have been multi-billed, how many blacks could have been multi-billed, and which ones were. But so you can use proxy measures for that. You look at so for example, recidivism rates for blacks and whites across the country, it's about 45 to 55 would be the difference. So the recidivism rates are higher for young black men, particularly, than young white men, but only by those 10 percentage points, not by a factor of 10 to 1.
But also in thinking about, because I used to work for the Legal Defense Fund,
Okay.
and so I've a lot of the research and stuff you're talking about, I
Sure.
don't want to
You've
know
been
the
there.
stuff, but I know it. But when you think about the factoring, even though there's the 10 percentage point, a lot of times people just see that, but don't think about the factors that then drive the recidivism
Oh, of
rate,
course.
like the communities that they're,
Of course,
and
of
so
course.
that's the frustrating part about, like, I love data, I love numbers, I
Mhm.
love all of that, and I just. Sometimes I think the numbers, though, without the context, not that you're doing this, but I'm saying when the conversation is happening, without the context, it dilutes the information.
It really does. So I think you don't have to be a sociologist to kind of understand that these crime patterns are systemic and collective, and yet we try to think of these things as individualistic and personal, including recidivism, right, as these choices,
Mhm.
without ever really talking about the context in which choices are made. How much freedom and agency
Right.
do people have when everything's falling apart around them, right? Yeah, you're absolutely right. But then, and so it does require a much bigger effort than just a criminal justice sort of reform. It requires something that we don't seem to have the will to do. But the multi-billing is something that could stop. It could stop tomorrow if DAs just decided that, maybe that's enough punishment, right? And that's not a decision for me to make. So, life without parole. Just sort of like going to go down here this rabbit hole for a minute. Life without parole, again, globally, in the United States, we sort of tend to sort of like forget the rest of the world. 80% of all people serving life without parole across the globe are in the United States. If we believe that folks who commit crimes in the United States are so much worse than others who commit similar crimes across the globe, then maybe that's justified. Louisiana is leading that metric. And the thing is, we are seeing a decline in incarceration rates across the country, okay, and have been. And most of those things come from similar efforts from the Justice Reinvestment Task Force of low-level drug offenders and so forth. At the same time, I think it's just like this silent thing that's happening. In 1992, 30 years ago, there were about 12,000 people serving life without parole across the country. There are now 55,000. That number's quadrupled, all the while the lower level offenders are driving incarceration rates down. So it's these two extremes. But in the end, what's going to keep the incarceration rate high is the folks who can't come home. Louisiana accounts for 16.6. That's actually more, almost, than these other states combined. So Alabama, 6.2. Texas is 0.5%. 0.5% of people serving time in prison in Texas are serving a life sentence. You can literally cross a state line. There are some people in my project who were living in Texas on the border and committed their offense in Shreveport, or actually one in Minden. The difference there is about a 20 to 25 year sentence or life without parole. And so we are it. Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Florida. But in terms of the rates, Louisiana is by far the leader of that. And again, if we look at racial disparities with life without parole sentences, New Orleans leads that disparity almost by 9-1, but everywhere the state rate is almost 6-1. So for every one white person serving a life sentence, there are 6 black folks right behind them.
Do you have a breakdown about when you're talking about the life without possibility of parole folks? Are you including the people who it's because of the multiple bills, or are you just?
Yeah, I have that.
Okay.
I have that. So there are about close to 3,000 people who have been multi-billed, and there are less than 1,000 of those who are serving a life sentence. And I have it all broken down by actually the only data I have is the instant offense. I don't have the previous ones. So. Yeah, I don't want to. I was gonna go into these numbers a little bit more. I could see that if you're just looking at a blank screen, it's not particularly meaningful. So recidivism. That's another issue that I think that what we get are these sort of blanket data on this. So we'll say, yeah, within 3 years, between 30 and 40% of folks across the country are returned to custody. So that's the way I measure recidivism is not with an arrest. Because I think that's misleading. I was evaluating Judge White, Judge White's reentry program since it started to now. It's with Marcus DeLarge, as you probably know. And I looked at a lot of reentry data, and I think the most reliable one is return to custody as opposed to anything else. But when we look at that, it's about 40%. Okay, in Louisiana, somewhere between 35 and 40%. And so when we hear that as citizens, we're like, oh my, this is crazy. We got to keep. It's too high. It's too high a risk. But the Department of Corrections and anybody who seems to track this recidivism data very rarely breaks that down into anything meaningful, right? It's just a whole bucket of folks. So they never look at age. They don't look at the amount of time served. They don't look at the age when they were confined. And they don't look at the offense category, except for broadly drug, violent, and so forth, the way we look at those things. So it's not particularly meaningful when we start then looking at risk factors. Studies, we have some studies that are popping up around the country. There was a study in California, about 860 folks who were serving a life sentence, became eligible for parole, came home. They were all convicted of murder. 5 were rearrested, 2 were returned to custody. That's pretty low.
Yeah.
That is less than 0.5%. California and Maryland, I don't know if you ever came across the Ungers in Maryland. The judge had provided the jury with inaccurate ways of understanding reasonable doubt, and as a result there's this class of folks, a few hundred of them, who were incarcerated in the 80s, who were then released after serving 3 decades. Recidivism rates, 0.5%. Something's happening with 0.5 with all these studies. Now we, of course, are in this beautiful experiment with the juvenile lifers who are coming home. I interviewed 35 of them. They were part of that bigger group. And I'm tracking them. 19 of them have come home, and they're all doing very well, as it happens, and the world didn't blow up. So there's a study in Pennsylvania, because of course that's another leader with us. Now, a study in Pennsylvania, it's been going on now since, well, Montgomery was 2016, people started coming home 2017. So we've got 5 years now over there. 1.5% is the recidivism rate. So I would say that the data that we do have suggests that when people are incarcerated at a very young age, and they have served 2 or more decades in prison, they pose an extremely small risk. If you're going to be driven by numbers and do risk assessment and public safety, that's your safest population. And so while they're the drivers, if we made that change, we would probably see a very small effect on public safety and a massive impact on incarceration rates. So with respect to cost and all these other things that we think about, that would be, what that really is a huge testament to the aging out phenomenon. I don't want to even say real, but people just age out. They get tired of it. Yeah, I'm sure you see it all the time. We see it in prison disciplinary records. We don't see it in reentry court. We don't see it with folks who are coming in, doing those 2-year stints. But we certainly do with the folks who are, and yet at the same time, where we have these studies that are showing us there's such a low risk in that population, we've quadrupled the life without parole population.
Has someone done the study as it relates to jail WAP and their sort of prison disciplinary records? Because I used to do jail work, and looking
Okay.
at the client's records, you saw the change.
Yeah.
You saw around the age of 22, 23, most of the major violations stopped happening.
Oh, yeah.
And then you would have maybe some sporadic ones. But has anyone sort of done that study to just, because that would be easy data to, and there are factors obviously, but that would be easy data to sort of look at and look into.
I've just done it anecdotally with, I can't help but care about the people I've gotten to know through this work. And when they come up for a pardon hearing or parole hearing, I help them put their packets together. And I always include a graph with the exact thing that you're talking about. And it's, they come to prison, it's way up here, and then and then the last 20 years nothing's been happening. Some of the difficulties with that is that you can have an aggravated disobedience right up for leaving your towel on your bed. So there, but still, the aging out phenomenon in prison perfectly replicates the aging out phenomenon in society. Actually, it's a young man's game. It just is. So I mentioned this need to sort of, let's make sense of the numbers. Another thing to do is to go to the people behind the numbers, and that's what this project was all about. So the Visiting Room Project, which is live now, is visitingroomproject.org. This first iteration is based on interviews with men, adult men. The next phase is with women, and then we'll bring in the juveniles. And the juveniles, I'm following. They as soon as they come home after 25, 30 years, they all get on Facebook. And so that's how I'm connected with them all, to follow up with them. And they're all doing really very well, actually. There's not a single person, a single juvenile in Louisiana. Actually, there's one that I've heard about, I don't know, who's even been rearrested since Montgomery, right? But they're an experiment, and they actually, I think some of them have a sense of just how important they are. They're sort of ambassadors for the ones left behind. And with the right reentry resources, are doing great things. So the folks in my project, and I'm going to focus in on the men's side of this for a minute. They were all convicted before the age of 25. They were all convicted of murder. And therefore all had the mandatory life without parole sentence. And they had all served a minimum of 20 years, some as many as 30. I'll introduce you to a fellow who served more than 60. At the beginning of this project, when I was putting together the parameters for inclusion, I was interested in exploring pushing the envelope of maturity, right? Because in my project I had 17 and 11 months old when they committed a second-degree murder, and I had a person who committed a murder on his 18th birthday, and one is home and the other is not, and is unlikely to go home. And again, 18 is arbitrary, 21 is also arbitrary, but there is a move across the country to perhaps look at the brain science behind that. I've tracked all of the Supreme Court rulings and the language and the studies in there, and I actually feel that there's reason to be quite optimistic. The Supreme Court rulings on juvenile life without parole, which is probably another presentation, without considering the ethics or the morality or the fairness or anything, just looking at the logical arguments that they've already put into place, have set the groundwork for us to re-examine mandatory sentencing schemes in general for anyone, but also the brain science to push the age of maturity to at least 21. There are no brain science deniers. There's no controversy about those things, and so I think that that's a place for some hope. So let me introduce you to the project.
When I was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole at the age of 22, My young mind didn't really understand it. I thought I'd get a chance to go home after a decade. Many years ago, Louisiana a release. 10-6 was brought to a halt and lifers were blocked from parole. There were other changes going on at the time too. Politicians were running long mandatory sentences instead. In Louisiana in 1979, just 1 year before I was arrested, lawmakers abolished parole eligibility for us lifers altogether. Guys who thought they would eventually have a chance to go home if they had shown the capacity to change and be rehabilitated were suddenly faced with a new reality. Life in prison, death by incarceration. Lawmakers kept growing the list of offenses that could get you mandatory life in prison without parole, from murder to selling heroin or acting as a getaway driver during a robbery gone wrong. By the time I reached Angola, the number of lifers sentenced to die in Louisiana prisons had doubled in less than a decade. 3/4 of those sentenced to life were black, like me. We were condemned to die on a former plantation where our ancestors had been enslaved. There is no doubt that most of us have done some terrible things and made terrible mistakes. There's some of us that were wrongfully incarcerated. Either way, without a chance to return to society, we are lost to the world. After 20, 30, or even 40 years, regardless of whether we changed or found ways to redeem ourselves, we are still here. Today, there are nearly 5,000 of us serving life without the possibility of parole in Louisiana. There are more of us per capita than any other state in the country or any place in the world. Many of us are old now, so old and so sick that Angola had to create a hospice program. A lot of us are volunteering to the hospice program, nursing people who, just like us, came here young and are dying in prison. Hospice gives us a glimpse of what we are headed for. When I first got to Angola, there was only one cemetery, Point Lookout, but now there are two, and the second one's almost full. Most people only hear about us when crime happens, but we have changed, and we invite you to sit with us now, decades later, to meet the people we have become. Like Darryl Waters, who is serving life without parole, says, there are everyday people behind these walls who love, who get sad, who hurt, who are happy, who have dreams. In a visiting room, you can hear us tell our stories in our own words.
In fact, Terry Pierce, we recorded that on a Friday in March before they locked down the prison for COVID on Monday. And Terry Pierce has come home because he's one of the folks whose cases was downgraded from second-degree murder to manslaughter, and he's released for time served in an agreement between the DA here in Orleans and his judge. One of the things that is, I think, perpetuating some of the sort of stagnation with thinking through these things is that there's a massive wall between people who are incarcerated and everybody else. And prisons were designed to keep people in, but they're also designed to keep people out. And so we don't see any of this. So to me, it's very logical for us to remain skeptical of rehabilitation and transformation or even aging out because we don't see it. And we get stuck on the person who was convicted. That's the last thing we see. It's the last account of what happened. Darryl Waters, who was referenced in there, when I interviewed him, he told me that the problem is that we're all stuck on that so-called thug on the street 25 years ago, all the while realizing that person doesn't even exist anymore. But if we are unable to see, if we're unable to connect with people, like anything else, we're unable to make any kind of empathetic connection with them, right? They just remain invisible and silenced. And so this project is an attempt to kind of break down some of that and give the public an opportunity to come in and see what these folks have become. You can do with that what you will, but at least I feel like it's a little bit cowardly the way the system is set up for us to, we just dispose of people, and then we don't ever have to confront the implications of that, ever. My feeling is, if we're going to continue to do that, at least do it openly. Confront it. See, check these folks out 30 years later, and if you still think, that's fine, but at least have that process. Because things are set up in ways that we can't ever get there. You can go to the rodeo, but we can't really get in there and see what's going on. That's what this project is trying to change. And so I'll show you a couple of profiles.
The worst part of Angola for me today, getting up and still being in Angola. Waking up and still being in Angola. That's the worst part. Knowing that I'm a changed man, knowing that I have the skills to go be a better person in society, knowing that I want to do better in society, and knowing that I can do better in society, and not having the opportunity to do that because I have a life sentence without parole. And I think every man that's gonna sit here in front of you today, they're gonna tell you the same thing. My name is Kondkar Riga. I was 20 years old, 19 years old, about to be 20 years old. I was convicted of second-degree murder, and I'm serving a life sentence. My kids, sometimes I hear the bitterness in their voices when I talk to them. You know, I try to give them advice and let them know that this is not something that they want to try. This is not something that they want to do. This is not something that they want to be a part of. Do the right thing so you'll never become a part of this. I just try to give them some of the advice that I never got. A young lady named Vanessa, she was my girlfriend on the streets, and she's been here for almost this entire ride. I praise her for being the person she is and being the woman that she is and being the woman that she's become. When I was convicted, I asked her to leave because I didn't know what to expect and what would be. You know, I got a life sentence, and she was young, I was young, you know. But eventually, a few years later, about maybe 8 years later, I got a letter from her. She said, man, I just, you know, I need to see this through, me and you in this situation. And she's been there ever since. I don't know, maybe if she wouldn't have came into my life, maybe I wouldn't have made the turnaround that I'm sitting here, you know, representing right now. When I got here, I was about 240 pounds, and I was real muscular, I was real ripped, you know, and I was a very physical person, and I was a big person that was good with his hands, and was willing to go into any realm of war that another man may have wanted to go in. So it was about proving who you were. And now I'm the type of person, when I hear things and see things, it's easy for me to walk away from them. That's a problem I had a long, long time ago.
anyone serving time at Angola can earn trustee status at the prison. Status is based on their conduct record over a long period of time. Being a trustee gives you additional freedoms of movement inside the prison.
So I decided that I want to try this trustee thing. You know, I haven't been in trouble in a while. I'm gonna fill out this paper and see if I can get a trustee status. They kept denying me. They kept denying me. They denied me 9 times. And so I said, well, I'm gonna try it one more time. I get the trustee status and I go to Camp F, and they send me to work at beautification, which is planting flowers, doing landscaping, lawn care, things like that. So I love planting flowers. I can tell you what soil, what flowers, what's needed, annuals, perennials, what's needed to be planted this season, that season, and then other season. When to take it up, when to put it back down. So from beautification, I wound up going from beautification to working in an administration building. Job I never thought I'd have because I was too messed up when I got here. But working in the administration building is one of the most prestigious jobs you could have. Then from the administration building, I went to the training academy. I like doing personal training. And they actually gave me a job in the training academy doing personal training for the officers. You have to grow up somewhere, be it in prison or as a free man, but eventually you will grow up. It's hard, it's hard. See, the paper that they would have in front of them, it doesn't tell who the person is. My record, the paper that they would be holding, it doesn't reflect, it doesn't tell them the person that I've become. It doesn't tell them the person that I am. There's a lot of good things I want to do when I go back out into the world. And I believe that I'm going to go back out into the world. Like I said, sometimes you got to trick yourself into believing that you want to go back out in the world, that you're going to go back out in the world. Because I see a lot of men lay under their covers and they're not sleeping, they're crying. You can hear them sometimes. You can hear men wake up out of their sleep from having nightmares of knowing they're going to die here. I had those nightmares, but I do my very best. I trick myself into believing that I'm gonna get out, and that's what I wake up for. See, I harness things of good things, my kids, my fiance, my mother, just all kind of things. You got to put that in front of you and look at it and focus on it because it'll mess you up. You never know. You don't know if you're going to wake up. You don't know if you're going to ever get out. You hold on to old memories. You see the guy next to you, he just died 2 days. Somebody that you were close to, he's dying from cancer. You see people die every day, and you wonder, you know, if you're gonna ever become that person, if you're gonna ever get out, you don't know.
Are any of you familiar with Kwan's case? So, when I started these interviews in 2017, There was no possibility, at least in my mind, that anything was going to change. And of course, the Civil Rights Division in Orleans Parish has opened up a case review of past cases, and as they're reviewing this case, they found in the record a clear and blatant Brady violation, where the eyewitness, who's the only person tying Kwan to the crime, came back twice and said, "That's not the person who did it. I pointed to photograph number 5.
Oh, wow.
There are handwritten notes from the assistant DA in the file. He's maintained his innocence the whole time, even though he admits he was messed up and getting into other kinds of trouble. And he is home. He's home and he's doing great. He works 2 jobs. This project has really taken off in a beautiful way that it's nothing to do with me. It's because of the authenticity of these folks. And 2 months after he got out, we were invited to go to the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts in D.C. And he went up there. I didn't. He went up there and presented the project and talked about his story. He went with one of our other contributors. So this project is not about innocence or Brady violations or anything else, but if you're going to get 150 people, a sample of those folks, you're going to run into some of these issues. As it happens, he's been fully exonerated. There are 3 people in my project from Orleans who have been fully exonerated, not just downgraded to manslaughter and time served. It happens. We have a legacy of an unusual legacy in this parish.
How's he doing now?
He's doing beautifully. I talk with him probably once a week, and we are starting a fellowship program. When we started this project, none of us expected that any one of them would ever come home and be sitting with us on a panel. It's honestly the most beautiful thing about it. And so we have started a fellowship program. We've just got about $750,000 from the Mellon Foundation, and we've got about 20 guys, some who are pardoned and others who have come home through the Civil Rights Division. We're going to put them through leadership training, social media training, public speaking. We've got the money. We're just going to start this program, and they're going to run it. They're going to own this project. So we have lots of really exciting things coming up, and more money coming in. Foundations are interested in funding reentry in this way. So they're going to have meaningful skills, and then they're going to take some ownership. We've got invitations to bring this project to Harvard and Yale and Duke and UVA in the next few months. They are going to be running that whole thing. Because it's not I started it, but it's theirs. Yes?
Yes, so I have a question about the subset of the population of lifers who were convicted of murder, and for whom there are no questions about
Sure.
whether you committed.
Sure.
Okay.
Which is most of them.
Okay. Are there data on, especially coming out of parole hearings, to the downgrading sentences, are there data on victims' representations in those hearings, and what are the data pointing to by way of victims' responses?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I have attended every pardon and parole hearing since 2017. Most of them now on Zoom. But I used to do that drive up to Baton Rouge. And it was a very good thing for me because I gained a great sensitivity to the victims, which I kind of theoretically knew, but it was still an abstraction, just like these folks are an abstraction until you get in there. And I would see the pain, when they would show up to these parole hearings. And it's hard to just be dismissive of that. So yes, but I was also amazed. I have a big book of field notes from everyone that's in it. I was amazed at how many times the victim's family would not oppose, and in some cases support. There have been some very unexpected things with this project. So 2 of the men in the project, they were both Orleans Parish, one of the father of the victim in both cases heard about this project. And they're like, well, you know, what happened to the guy who did this to my son? Well, and I'm not in the business of knocking on doors about this thing, but they asked, can you, I'd like to see the interview. And actually there was a Guardian article about it not that long ago with a fellow named Charles Amos. Judge White allowed me to bring the two folks together in chambers. And it was a bit odd, but it was very heartfelt. And the victim's father forgave him. It's like a fairy tale. And it was such just genuine, but he just wanted to know, and he wanted to know why. Victims very often just want to know why. Why did you do this? And sometimes just an explanation is enough to just move on. I'm not suggesting that everybody's that way, but in this particular case, Mr. Wilson is the name of the victim's father. He lives in the 7th Ward. I went down to his house in his living room. He's disabled, in a wheelchair, and I showed him the entire unedited interview, and he was just weeping. And he right there, he said, I want him to come home. He deserves to have another chance. And that's why I'm not an attorney. I'm like, okay, well, let's get an attorney, get an affidavit, and things moved from there. Now his sister, and he plays chess with him once a week in his house. His sister works for a company that does in-home health care. The same company that was, and she asked if she could be assigned to him. So they're in each other's lives in this really interesting way at this point. The other case with Everett Offrey, who is, some of you know as well, his father wanted to forgive him and supported him. So you have these odd opportunities for reconciliation, but it starts with meeting the person. Who have they become? In Kwan's case, the really sad part there was the victim's mother was truly denied justice, right? So the person who killed her son was not brought to justice, and she's living with this understanding that somehow her life is entwined with this man who served 28 years by the time he got out of prison. So, and then there are victims' families who are just adamantly opposed. They're like, I don't care. My son didn't get to have this other chance. In fact, there's only one case out of 100 and plus that are out on Twitter and everywhere else now. There's one case where there was a victim's family who was like, why does he get to tell his story? And that's also very understandable. The other thing that I've learned, and I think it's really important to get a bit more nuanced about this, we tend to think of these things as there's the good guys and the bad guys. We've been doing screenings in churches across New Orleans, and what I've realized, I had no idea, but it's very common to have the same family lose a son to gun violence and have another son in Angola, or another cousin or nephew. And so they don't see it in this way that we kind of impose that on them. There's the victims, and they see it in a much more nuanced way. And so I've stopped really thinking of, like, we've got to make sure we reach out to these people and make sure. This is an invitation just to have a more meaningful conversation about what we are doing by meeting some of the people behind the data and then moving on from there. Okay, the last, I don't know how we're doing on time, but I
just wanted to tell you, Judge Lewis, the Civil Rights Unit have a robust investigation unit that reach out to victims when
Yes.
they're doing it. It's really part of the whole review of cases is victim outreach.
And they're very active with the victim outreach,
Very
right?
much so.
Yeah, and I think very thoughtful about that. And the thing is that I think that I would never say that this is a good service for victims. You know, I don't see that as, victims can define their situation how they wish to, but it's surprising how those investigators come back with, what, that guy's still in prison? You know, so often there.
The reason I asked the question about victims is because I think that in terms of public perception, it can absolutely have an effect, I believe, if victims' voices are part of the
Sure.
conversation around reform.
Sure.
in a very explicit, data-driven way. That's why I wanted to know.
I totally
what is the
agree
data
with you.
indicating?
I totally agree with you. And again, once we recognize that those same families are affected on both sides of these issues, you can have just a much more empathetic conversation. But they have to be invited on their own terms.
Right.
So, yeah, the project does not have the capacity to go and look and interview victims' families, but it's very sensitive to the fact that, and you know, one of the things that comes out, so there are over 100 of these interviews. There's you know, close to 40 profiles. In almost all of them, the men themselves speak to that. They're not permitted to contact victims' families, but many of them have experienced having a loved one killed, and so it's not a huge leap for them to understand, to make that empathetic leap to understand just how much harm they've caused, and then express this genuine remorse. You can't fake some of these things, quite honestly. And so that, I think, is coming out of this project as well in a sort of thoughtful way. I didn't script it. That's how they talked about it. In fact, I very deliberately stepped away from some of the specific aspects of the offense because I did not want them to be in a situation where they would make a contradictory statement that would come up in so there was some redaction of that. But they all talk about the harm that they caused the victims' families. It's a kind of a reminder to me that if we do nothing, Kwan would end up being this last contributor.
When I come in, I was 17. I'm 80 years old now. Right. Yeah, I survived. So did. I want to know how I survived. I had a tough time. I couldn't have been changed in 1953. See, when I come in, it wasn't going to school and things like they doing now. You know, the people were hard on you. They didn't care whether you get a trade or not. But it done changed now, it's different. They was working you. See, they ain't doing nothing now. Go out there and pick a little green, pick a little cotton or something like that. But when they was working. Well, I still can do work, you know, I mean, enough to get by. Right. I'm 81 years old. You know? I'm still a dermatologist in my dorm. I'm a helper. I got point here. 30-degree burn receipts. They used to sell cigarette lighters here and lighter fluid and all that. I had to do throw something on me in the cell. I was in the cell, locked down in a block right over there. Camp B block. Throw some lighter fluid on me. Boing. At the time, I had been out of the shower and they were letting them out the shower, out the cell. With some note, he had the lighter fluid in the bucket and had it lit up and he dashed it in my cell. On me. Fluid hit me and bounced over and had 30-degree burn. 1/2 of my body. I'm lucky to be living there. And I went to New Orleans and stayed in the chair for a few years. I had a few people seeing me in that angle like Reno was writing, and some of them went to write me, they called them pen pals. I had about 2 or 3 of them. It seemed where I had been in penitentiary, so where he been in penitentiary, you know. But I had got a couple more on my list. They come see me a few times. Right. What is for? I don't know. I mean, one thing I need to be out. Where's thing been for this long? I'll go somewhere and make me a living. I'm start all over again. Yeah. They say the older you get, the more you learn. Well, I was learning a lot of things, you understand? So, see, like I said, I've been here all my life. I ain't never really had a chance to get out, because I've been here all my life.
Can you read that? Sammy passed away in 2019. He served 66 years in prison, more time than any other man in Louisiana. He was 83. We actually have we have this billboard. I don't know if you can see it. It's flying in Detroit right now. It doesn't reference the project, but you can track it down. It's just to, again, get people to start thinking about this.
Is that him as a young child?
Yes. Yeah. That is him. Actually, that picture was taken in 1958. He came in 1953. His story is crazy because he came to Angola with a 10-year sentence as a juvenile. He had run away from a juvenile facility. And that sentence was later vacated because he had no legal counsel. But by that time, he had killed another person at Angola, which was not uncommon in the 50s. And so he was serving a life sentence for that murder. But he should have never been in there in the first place as a kid.
What do you do when they're that age? 'Cause I'm sure you have older people who are part of the project, correct?
Oh, yeah.
So what do you do when they're that age as far as reentry? Because all they know
Yeah.
is jail. I mean,
Quite
they don't
honestly,
know, or prison. They don't know anything else.
Yeah, he was the oldest person.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't sure how I was going to, my project wasn't really designed for it, and I was honestly just quite taken aback because I'm sitting there thinking, Mr. Robinson, he's again, it's part of his narrative is so clearly in his mind that you get out and you start your life again. You know, at 81, it's just it's a narrative that's it's unbearable to move away from that and think of like, oh, I'll go to hospice care. But yeah, the project actually, Sammy ended up being a person who I consider look at and think about, like if we don't try to alleviate some of this for older people who've been there for decades, that's what we're looking at. And I don't think that makes sense for anybody, for octogenarians in hospice care. But the vast majority of people, to answer your question, were in their 40s and 50s. Yeah.
So, similar to what you're asking, Nandi and I are trying to, we got a grant to do a reentry program. But specifically, our reentry program targets individuals who have served 20 years or more, and they're 45 years and older.
Uh-huh.
Because, you know, as he stated, our DA, they're resentencing a lot of people, so people are coming home. But the question is, what do you do with a person that's been in for 2 decades? And so we're trying to create a pathway for them to come out, so that way they have the services that they need. They get exposed to what's changed in society. So it is brand new, and we haven't quite launched it yet. We haven't had anyone released into our program yet, but we're planning on doing that in March. But the reason why we did it was because when we went to visit Angola, we have the reentry program that you mentioned for Judge White and Judge DeLarge, where people are sentenced into that program. They have to do 8 months, but they have mentors in the prison, and those mentors are the older guys that are there. We're sitting in this room, they're talking to us about being mentors and all their experiences, and these are brilliant men who have all these certificates and all this training, and we're like, something's wrong with this picture. We have people that you are entrusting these younger guys to take advice from, but we aren't comfortable with them being let back into society.
By the way, we're let in at Angola by a gentleman named John, who is wearing a mechanic uniform,
John Sheehan.
driving
Yes.
his own car, who have keys to the gates, and he is a lifer.
Serving a life sentence, yeah. And so it just baffled us, yeah.
Trustee.
But I mean, he's like,
More than a trustee.
he could
He's
walk
a-
out the door himself, like he literally had keys and was driving around. If they hadn't told us, we wouldn't have even thought that he was a person that's serving a life sentence. And so we're just thinking to ourselves, if you trust this man with keys in a car, but you don't trust him to be out, and then with the work that Jason's doing, that's when we came up with the idea for our reentry program, because we realized you can't just drop them back, you know, that there has to be something put into place.
It was a 10-6 that released in my section. He came here from Florida in 1960, 6 months here, 19 years old, he gets arrested. He was he was seeing a white lady, and he gets convicted of rape, and he serves 58 years, and he's released 2 years ago. Watching him use a phone, like he has no family in Orleans. I keep in touch with him. Him entering society as he sees it now is just like amazing to watch, right? Because there are things that happen to this world that has just kind of been missed. Andrew Hudley at the Parole Project in Baton Rouge, he does this amazing reintegration program with people who are coming out on parole, and it deals with things that we take for granted, things like going to Walmart, being amongst crowds of
Self-checkout.
people,
Right.
self-checkout, telephone. Charles Amos texts me all the time.
Every
He's
day.
fascinated with these memes and texts, and he texts me about his first airline, his flight, and you know, just kind of if we walk away from the charge, but we talk about whether rehabilitation, what is the purpose of prison? Is it rehabilitation, or are we just throwing humans away? And because we're talking about economy, I wish we address how much it's costing us
Right.
to keep these individuals, like how much we spent on Mr.